Chapter 5. The Dodsons were certainly a handsome family, especially Mrs. Glegg. Even at 50 years old, she had a very comely face and figure, although Tom and Maggie considered her the epitome of ugliness. Though she could afford the most expensive clothes, and often did, she preferred to wear old clothes until they were threadbare and smelling of mould. She also refused to wear her best wigs to visit her sister. She was greatly offended by Mrs. Tulliver's choice to wear her hair naturally. Mrs. Glegg, in fact, constantly insulted her sister's curly hair, often making Mrs. Tulliver cry. The day she arrived at the Tullivers, she refused to even take off her bonnet. She thought their house was too draughty. "I wonder where our sister Pullet is," she said to Mrs. Tulliver, looking at her pocket watch. "She used to be more like me. I don't know what happened. You should go ahead and serve the dinner, sister," she said. "I'm sure she'll be here soon. And besides, dinner is not ready until 1:30, said Mrs. Tulliver, annoyed. "What nonsense to have dinner at 1:30, when you should have it at 1. You weren't brought up that way, Bessy." "What can I do, Jane? Mr. Tulliver likes his dinner at 2, but I made it half an hour earlier because of you." "It's a pity you're not a stronger person." "Your children will suffer for it, and I hope you didn't prepare anything extravagant. You should be more like your sister Diane. She is far more sensible," said Mrs. Clegg. "You should save your money." Mrs. Tulliver did not like quarrelling with her sister. "Mr. Tulliver insists on having a good dinner for his friends, and he is right to do as he wants in his own house, sister." "Well, Bessy, I can't leave your children enough money to keep them from ruin." Fortunately, the sound of the carriage outside interrupted the discussion. Mrs. Tulliver rushed out to meet her sister and her husband. Mrs. Pullet had arrived in tears, and Mrs. Tulliver rushed her inside. Mrs. Glegg demanded to know what was the matter, and her sister confessed that a good friend had recently died. "Well, I never heard of her, and she's certainly no relation, of course. Why should you be upset about people who don't belong to you?" Mrs. Pullet composed herself and went upstairs to remove her bonnet. Mrs. Tulliver followed her. She loved examining her sister's fine clothes and hats. She herself dressed well, but could never get Maggie to wear anything respectable. That day she wanted the child to wear a silk dress given by Mrs. Glegg, but Maggie had ruined it almost immediately. Mrs. Pullet, for her part, did not really prefer Tom and Maggie. She was more fond of her sister Diane's daughter, Lucy, and actually felt quite sorry that Mrs. Tulliver had 2 naughty, awkward children. The sisters agreed in Mrs. Tulliver's absence that the Dodson blood and the Tulliver blood did not mix well. She was reminded of this upon the arrival of the Dianes. Mrs. Diane was the least attractive of the Dodson sisters, but Lucy was a beautiful child. Maggie looked even more wild and dark standing next to her. It was like comparing a rough, overgrown puppy to a white kitten. Lucy was a neat, straight child who looked up with shy pleasure at Maggie when she arrived. Maggie always looked at Lucy with delight. "Oh, Lucy," she said, kissing her cousin, "you'll stay with me and Tom, won't you?" "Excuse me," called Aunt Glegg. "Is it polite for children to come into a room without noticing their aunts and uncles?" Mrs. Tulliver commanded the children to speak to them. Mrs. Glegg began to fuss over them. "Stand up straight, Tom, and put your hair behind your ears and keep your dress on your shoulder, Maggie," she commanded loudly. She always spoke to them as if they were either deaf or idiotic. "Look how brown this child is," she said of Maggie. "It makes me wonder. And you should have her hair cut." Maggie felt the anger rising inside her. She decided to concentrate on her cousin, who she rarely saw. "Wouldn't you like to stay with us tonight, without your mother?" she asked. "Yes, mother, may I?" Lucy said timidly. "Let her stay," said Mr. Diane to his wife. He was a large man with the kind of physique present in all ranks of English society, bald head, red whiskers, and a body that was solid without being heavy. One could see noblemen who looked just like Mr. Dean, but also grocers and day labourers. No man was thought of more highly in the town of St. Ogg's. Mrs. Tulliver pulled Maggie to her and whispered for her to go upstairs and brush her hair. Maggie pulled Tom along with her on her way out. "There's something I want to do before dinner," she said. Tom followed his sister to their mother's room, where she opened a drawer and pulled out a pair of scissors. "What are those for?" he asked. She answered by pulling her hair in front of her face and cutting it straight across the middle of her forehead. "Oh!" cried Tom. "You'll get in big trouble. You better not cut any